Edward Harrington sat alone in the grand library of his sprawling mansion, surrounded by the relics of a life devoted to wealth and power. The room, with its high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, was filled with an air of quiet desolation. The ticking of an ornate grandfather clock echoed in the silence, each tick a reminder of the passage of time that had slipped away, leaving behind a trail of regrets and missed opportunities. At 75, Edward was a man who had everything and nothing at the same time. His fortune, built on the backs of others, had afforded him a life of luxury, but at a cost he was only now beginning to understand. He had no family left. His wife had passed years ago, and his only son, estranged and distant, was lost to him. Edward's days were filled with solitude, punctuated by memories of the ruthless decisions he had made in his relentless pursuit of success. As Edward sipped his morning tea, a letter arrived, delivered by his longtime butler, James. The sight of the letter, with its crisp envelope and neat handwriting, was a rarity in Edward's life. He rarely received personal correspondence, and when he did, it was usually from charities or institutions seeking donations. But this letter was different. The name on the return address made his heart skip a beat. Martha Collins. Martha Collins was a name Edward had not thought of in years, but it was one that was deeply intertwined with his past. She had been a formidable business partner, one of the few people who had ever matched Edward's drive and ambition. Together, they had built a successful real estate empire, but their partnership had ended abruptly after a bitter disagreement. Edward had made a decision that had devastated Martha. He had sold off a portion of their company without consulting her, a move that had left her financially crippled and personally betrayed. Edward hesitated before opening the letter, a sense of foreboding settling over him. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the crisp paper. The words that greeted him were far from what he expected. "Dear Edward, I never thought I would write to you again after all these years. The pain you caused me was something I struggled to forgive. But time has a way of softening even the hardest of hearts. I am writing to you now because there is something you must know, something that has haunted me for years. You may not be aware, but the decision you made all those years ago had far-reaching consequences. My son, Michael, who was only a child at the time, was deeply affected by the loss of our livelihood. He struggled with the burden of my financial ruin, and as he grew older, that burden became too much for him to bear. Michael took his own life 3 years ago, and I have lived with that pain ever since. I do not write this to blame you, Edward, but to inform you of the truth. I have come to terms with my grief, but I felt you should know what your actions led to. Perhaps it will offer you some clarity, or perhaps it will simply weigh on your conscience, as it has on mine. Sincerely, Martha Collins." Edward read the letter twice, each word cutting deeper than the last. He had always prided himself on being a man who could live with his decisions, no matter how difficult they were. But this was something different. The realization that his actions had contributed to the death of an innocent young man was a burden unlike any he had ever faced. He sat in the quiet of his library, the letter trembling in his hands. For the first time in years, tears welled up in his eyes. He had always justified his decisions as necessary for the success he had achieved, but now, confronted with the human cost of his actions, those justifications felt hollow. Edward knew he could not change the past. Michael was gone, and nothing he did would bring him back. But as he sat there, surrounded by the trappings of his wealth, a thought began to take root in his mind. Perhaps, in the time he had left, he could find a way to make amends, not just for Michael, but for all the others he had wronged along the way. The idea was both daunting and strangely liberating. For the first time in decades, Edward felt a spark of purpose. He would use his fortune, not to accumulate more wealth, but to undo the damage he had done. He would find a way to help those he had hurt, even if it meant doing so from the shadows. The next morning, Edward awoke with a clarity of mind he hadn't felt in years. The path before him was uncertain, but he knew he had to start somewhere. Martha Collins would be the first. Edward spent the day researching Martha's current circumstances. Despite the passing years, He had kept tabs on many of his former associates, and it didn't take long to find out that Martha was living in a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. The real estate empire they had built together was long gone, and Martha had struggled to rebuild her life after their falling out. Edward made a call to his lawyer, instructing him to anonymously pay off all of Martha's debts. The amount was substantial, but it was a mere fraction of Edward's vast wealth. As the lawyer assured him that the transaction would be handled discreetly, Edward felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It was a small step, but it was a start. Later that evening, Edward sat by the fire in his study, a sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt he was doing something that mattered, not just for himself, but for others. The journey ahead would be difficult, and he knew he couldn't right every wrong, but he was determined to try. As the fire crackled softly, Edward allowed himself a rare smile. He had spent a lifetime taking from others. Now, he would dedicate whatever time he had left to giving back, to making amends for the life he had lived. And in that moment, he knew he was finally on the path to redemption. Edward Harrington's days had taken on a new rhythm. Each morning, he awoke with a purpose, something that had eluded him for decades. But with this newfound sense of mission came the weight of memories that he had long buried, now resurfacing with an intensity he wasn't prepared for. As he sat by the window of his study, watching the rain fall softly against the glass, Edward's thoughts drifted back to another time, another life. The face of James Anderson came to mind, unbidden but vivid, as if he were standing in the room with him. James had been more than a business partner. He had been a friend whom Edward had betrayed. They had met in their youth, two ambitious men with dreams of making it big. James had been the more idealistic of the two, always talking about using their success to make a positive impact on the world. Edward, on the other hand, had been driven by a hunger for power and wealth, a hunger that eventually consumed him. The journey ahead would be difficult, and he knew he couldn't right every wrong, but he was determined to try. As the fire crackled softly, Edward allowed himself a rare smile. He had spent a lifetime taking from others. Now he would dedicate whatever time he had left to giving back, to making amends for the life he had lived. And in that moment, he knew he was finally on the path to redemption. Edward Harrington's days had taken on a new rhythm. Each morning, he awoke with a purpose, something that had eluded him for decades. But with this newfound sense of mission came the weight of memories that he had long buried, now resurfacing with an intensity he wasn't prepared for. As he sat by the window of his study, watching the rain fall softly against the glass, Edward's thoughts drifted back to another time, another life. The face of James Anderson came to mind, unbidden but vivid, as if he were standing in the room with him. James had been more than a business partner. He had been a friend whom Edward had betrayed. They had met in their youth, two ambitious men with dreams of making it big. James had been the more idealistic of the two, always talking about using their success to make a positive impact on the world. Edward, on the other hand, had been driven by a hunger for power and wealth, a hunger that eventually consumed him. He contacted his lawyer once more, instructing him to set up a trust fund for James's children, ensuring that their education and future were secure. He also made arrangements for an anonymous investment to be funneled into James's business, enough to pull it out of debt and provide the capital needed for it to thrive. Edward was meticulous in ensuring that James would never know the source of the money. It had to be this way. James deserved to rebuild his life on his own terms, without the burden of knowing that it was Edward who had interfered. As these plans were set in motion, Edward felt the familiar mix of relief and guilt. He was helping, yes, but it didn't erase the fact that it was his actions that had put James in this position in the first place. The past was immutable, and no amount of money could change what had been done. But at least, in some small way, he could give James a chance to rebuild, to find the success that had been stolen from him. With each passing day, Edward's thoughts turned to others he had wronged. The list was long, too long. and he knew he couldn't help everyone. But there were certain people, certain faces, that haunted him more than others. One of those faces was Laura Bennett. Laura had been a young, bright employee at one of Edward's companies, full of promise and potential. She had been passionate about her work, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. But in a moment of frustration and arrogance, Edward had dismissed her over a minor mistake, not realizing at the time how much she had depended on that job. She had been supporting her sick mother, and without that income, her life had quickly spiraled out of control. Edward's memories of Laura were tinged with regret. She had been the kind of employee any company would be lucky to have, and yet, he had let his temper and pride get the better of him. The years that followed had not been kind to Laura. She had struggled to find stable work, and her mother had eventually passed away, leaving her with a mountain of medical bills. Determined to make things right, Edward set out to find Laura. He discovered that she was living in a small rundown apartment, barely making ends meet. She had taken on multiple part-time jobs just to stay afloat, and the spark that had once defined her had dimmed considerably. Edward knew he couldn't undo the pain he had caused, but he could offer her a chance at a new beginning. He reached out to a prominent company in the city, one that he still had connections with, and arranged for them to offer Laura a high-level position. The offer was presented as a result of her impressive work history and potential, with no mention of Edward's involvement. A week later, Edward received a discreet message confirming that Laura had accepted the job. The relief he felt was tempered by the knowledge that this was only one small step in a much larger journey. There were so many others he had hurt, and he couldn't help but wonder if he would ever truly find peace. But as he sat in his study that evening, reflecting on the day's events, Edward allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. For the first time in a long while, he felt he was making a difference, one person at a time, one act of kindness after another. It was a slow process, but it was one he was committed to seeing through, no matter how long it took. The path to redemption was long and fraught with challenges, but Edward was determined to walk it, even if it meant doing so in the shadows. He had lived a life of selfishness and greed, but perhaps, in the twilight of his years, he could find a way to balance the scales, to leave behind a legacy of healing rather than harm. Edward Harrington had spent the past months orchestrating acts of redemption from the shadows. He had been meticulous, ensuring that his interventions were subtle, his presence unknown. But as his efforts expanded, so too did the complexities of his mission. What began as a straightforward path to redemption soon became riddled with unexpected challenges. The first sign of trouble came when one of his attempts to help was outright rejected. Edward had arranged for an old business associate, Robert Gaines, to receive a substantial sum of money to save his failing small business. Robert had been one of Edward's most loyal allies, until Edward's ambition had led to the collapse of a joint venture, leaving Robert in financial ruin. The guilt had haunted Edward for years, and he believed that this act of restitution would bring some measure of peace. However, when Robert received the anonymous financial offer, he refused it. Robert had grown suspicious of gifts that seemed too good to be true, having been burned too many times in the past. He suspected that the money was part of some elaborate scam or that it came with strings attached, and he wanted nothing to do with it. Edward was taken aback. He hadn't anticipated this level of mistrust. How could he make amends if those he sought to help refused his aid? This rejection stirred a deeper conflict within Edward. He began to wonder if his efforts were truly making a difference. Were his acts of kindness enough to erase the pain he had caused? Or was he merely salving his own conscience without truly addressing the damage done? These questions gnawed at him, creating a rift between his intentions and the reality of the situation. As Edward continued his journey, he encountered more resistance. Some of the people he helped began to grow suspicious, their curiosity piqued by the sudden, untraceable assistance they were receiving. Rumors started to circulate about a mysterious benefactor who was meddling in people's lives. This unintended consequence worried Edward. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to himself. His entire plan hinged on anonymity, on giving without recognition, on redemption without public acknowledgement. Edward's internal conflict deepened with each passing day. He had set out to correct the wrongs of his past, but now he questioned whether his actions were truly justifiable. Could redemption be found in secret deeds, or did it require something more? The moral dilemmas he faced grew more complex as he realized that his interventions, though well-meaning, could potentially cause more harm than good. What if his help was seen as manipulation? What if, instead of healing wounds, he was reopening them? These thoughts weighed heavily on Edward's mind, and for the first time since he began his mission, he hesitated. The confidence he had felt, the sense of purpose that had driven him, began to wane. He found himself questioning every decision, every step he had taken. Could he truly make amends, or was he simply deluding himself into believing that his wealth could fix the past? The tension in Edward's life reached a new level when he received alarming news from his doctor. A routine checkup had revealed a serious health issue, one that had been silently progressing for years. Edward's heart was failing him, and the prognosis was grim. He had little time left. This revelation added a desperate urgency to Edward's mission. The clock was ticking, and he knew he had to act quickly if he was to complete his journey of redemption. But this new reality also forced him to confront his own mortality in a way he never had before. The stakes were higher now, and the pressure to make things right became almost unbearable. In the midst of this turmoil, Edward discovered that one of the men he had wronged, Henry Thompson, was actively trying to track him down. Henry had been a small business owner whose livelihood was destroyed by one of Edward's corporate takeovers. Unlike the others, Henry wasn't interested in receiving help. He wanted revenge. He had spent years harboring a grudge against the unknown figure who had ruined his life, and when the mysterious benefactor began to change the lives of those around him, Henry became suspicious. Henry was a tenacious man, and his suspicion quickly turned into a determined quest to uncover the identity of his benefactor. He believed that the anonymous gifts and interventions were part of a larger scheme, one designed to manipulate and control. Henry's distrust of power and wealth had grown into an obsession, and he was determined to expose whoever was behind these actions. Edward, unaware of Henry's intentions, continued his work, but the mounting tension was impossible to ignore. He could sense that things were beginning to spiral out of control. His carefully laid plans were unraveling, and the very people he sought to help were becoming more wary of his influence. The idea that his efforts could lead to unintended consequences, or even danger, was a new and terrifying reality. As Henry got closer to discovering Edward's identity, the old man's fears began to materialize. He realized that his journey toward redemption was fraught with risks, not just for himself but for the people he was trying to help. If his identity were revealed, it could unravel everything he had worked for, potentially harming those he wished to protect. Edward faced a crossroads. He could abandon his mission, retreating into the safety of his anonymity, or he could press on, risking exposure in the hope of completing his redemption. But as his health continued to deteriorate, Edward knew that his time was running out. The choices he made in the coming days would define not only his legacy, but the lives of those he had affected. The realization that his actions could lead to unintended consequences, possibly even tragedy, left Edward with a profound sense of dread. He had set out to right the wrongs of his past, but now he feared that his efforts might only lead to further pain. The journey he had embarked on was no longer about redemption alone. It had become a race against time, a battle against the very forces he had once unleashed. As Edward pondered his next move, the weight of his decisions bore down on him like never before. The path ahead was uncertain, the risks immense, but he knew that he had to see it through, no matter the cost. Because in the end, redemption was all he had left. Edward Harrington had reached a point where he knew he could no longer remain in the shadows. The weight of his deeds, both good and bad, pressed heavily on him, and the time had come to confront the consequences of his actions head-on. He had hoped that by remaining anonymous he could right the wrongs of his past without reopening old wounds. But as his journey progressed, it became clear that some wounds could not heal in darkness. They needed the light of truth. With his health deteriorating rapidly, Edward decided that he had to reveal his identity to at least one person he had helped. He chose Martha Collins. The letter she had written him had been the catalyst for his journey, and he believed that if anyone could understand his motives, it would be her. He hoped that by coming forward, he might find the forgiveness and closure he so desperately sought. Edward arranged a meeting with Martha, choosing a quiet, secluded park where they could speak without interruptions. He arrived early, his heart pounding in his chest, both from nerves and the strain on his failing heart. He had rehearsed what he would say countless times, but as he saw Martha approaching, all the words seemed to slip away. Martha looked older than he remembered, but her eyes still held that same fire that had once made her a formidable business partner. She greeted him with a guarded expression, clearly curious about why he had asked to see her in person after so many years. They sat on a bench beneath a large oak tree, the autumn leaves rustling gently in the breeze. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Then, with a deep breath, Edward began to speak, recounting the story of his journey toward redemption, of the anonymous help he had offered her and others. "I know I've done terrible things, Martha," Edward said, his voice trembling slightly. "I know that money can't erase the pain I've caused, but I needed to try, to make things right, even if only a little." Martha listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When Edward finally finished, he looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. But Martha's response was not what he had hoped for. Her face hardened, and she stood up abruptly, turning to face him with a look of betrayal. "You think money can fix this, Edward?" she said, her voice laced with anger. "You think that throwing money at me, at others you've hurt, will make it all go away? You ruined lives, Edward. You destroyed families, dreams, futures. And now at the end of your life you think you can just buy your way into heaven?" Edward felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. He had expected anger, perhaps even hatred, but not this. Martha's words cut deep, and for a moment, he felt as if all his efforts had been in vain. The redemption he sought seemed further away than ever. Martha continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "You can't manipulate people's lives like this, Edward. You can't just decide when and how to make things right on your terms. It's not about you. It's about us, the people you hurt. And we're not just chess pieces for you to move around." Edward was silent, the weight of her words crushing him. He had thought that by helping he was doing the right thing, but now he saw how blind he had been. Martha's reaction shattered the illusion he had built around his actions. He had been so focused on his own redemption that he had failed to consider the real impact on the people he was trying to help. As Martha turned to leave, Edward reached out, his voice desperate. "Martha, please. I'm sorry. I truly am. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to. I don't have much time left." Martha paused, her back to him. For a long moment she stood there, silent and unmoving. Then, without turning around, she said, "Maybe some things just can't be fixed, Edward. Maybe the best you can do is live with what you've done." With that, she walked away, leaving Edward alone on the bench, his heart heavy with regret. He had hoped for forgiveness, but instead, he was left with the bitter realization that some wounds were too deep to heal. As he sat there, lost in thought, another figure approached. It was Henry Thompson, the man who had been searching for the mysterious benefactor. Edward recognized him immediately, his heart sinking further. This was the moment he had feared, the moment when his past would catch up with him in the most direct and painful way. Henry's face was a mask of fury as he confronted Edward. "So it was you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "All this time, it was you pulling the strings, playing God with our lives. What's your angle, Harrington? What do you get out of this?" Edward didn't try to deny it. He was too tired, too defeated to put up any pretense. "I'm just trying to make things right, Henry," he said quietly. "I know I've hurt you, and I know I can never undo the damage. But I wanted to help in any way I could." Henry's anger flared. "Help? You think this is help?" You think you can just swoop in, throw some money around, and we'll all be grateful? You don't get to decide how we heal, Harrington. You don't get to make that call. Edward felt the last remnants of his strength draining away. He had tried so hard to make amends, but it seemed that every step he took only made things worse. The redemption he sought felt more elusive than ever, slipping further out of reach with every passing moment. As Henry's words echoed in the air, Edward felt a sharp pain in his chest. He clutched at his heart, struggling to breathe, as the realization of his mortality struck him with full force. The confrontation, the rejection, it was all too much. Henry's anger faltered as he saw Edward's distress. He stepped forward, concern replacing the fury in his eyes. "Edward, are you—" Edward managed a weak nod, his vision blurring. "I'm sorry, Henry," he whispered. "I truly am. I wanted to fix things, but I see now. Some things can't be fixed." Henry hesitated, his hands hovering uncertainly. The man before him was no longer the ruthless tycoon who had destroyed lives, but an old, frail human being struggling to find peace before it was too late. With a sigh, Henry's anger began to melt away, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. He had spent years hating Edward, but now, as he looked into the eyes of the man who had caused him so much pain, he realized that hate was not the answer. Forgiveness, difficult as it was, might be the only way to break free from the past. Gently, Henry helped Edward to sit down on the bench, the old man's breathing labored and shallow. "Maybe we can't change the past, Edward," Henry said quietly, "but we can choose what we do with the time we have left." Edward looked up at him, tears welling in his eyes. Do you think it's possible to find peace, even after everything?" Henry nodded slowly. "I think it's possible, but it's not something you can buy, Edward. It has to come from within." As they sat there in the fading light of the afternoon, a tentative understanding began to form between them. The road to forgiveness was long and difficult, but it was a road they could walk together. Later that evening, Edward returned to his mansion feeling more at peace than he had in years. He knew that his journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt that he was on the right path. Martha's reaction still weighed on him, but he understood that forgiveness couldn't be forced. It had to be earned, and sometimes it might never come. As Edward lay in bed that night, he reflected on the life he had lived, the mistakes he had made, and the people he had hurt. He knew that he couldn't undo the past, but he also knew that his efforts, flawed as they were, had been sincere. In the end, redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting it and finding a way to live with it. With that thought, Edward closed his eyes, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. He had spent his life chasing wealth and power, but in his final days, he had found something far more valuable: peace. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us keep bringing you more stories like this one.